Welcome everybody to CDBG-CV Monitoring, how to prepare for a successful HUD monitoring visit. A few housekeeping slides before we begin. First of all, my name is Duncan Yetman. I am the Deputy Director of the Entitlement Communities Division in the Office of Block Grant Assistance here at HUD headquarters. And I've got a lot of information for you today in our 2-hour presentation. I appreciate your patience working with me. Unlike the previous session, which Carrie, Les, and Olivia did an excellent job on, I am working solo. So as you type in your questions, I'll try to get to them. There may be an opportunity or a situation where we will need to pause the answering of the questions or deal with the questions at one point within the course of the presentation. So let me first cover a few housekeeping slides with you all. The PowerPoint presentations and this webinar recording will be available on the HUD Exchange afterwards. You can use closed captions by using the arrow pointing to the show captions box there on your screen, and consult the attendee guide if you have any questions about the resources page or the other resources made available for today's presentation. Prior to today's presentation, I did send 2 attachments to our vendor site. The one being a PDF of this presentation, the other being Chapter 2 of the CPD Monitoring Handbook. I'll be making constant references to Chapter 2 of the CPD Monitoring Handbook throughout this presentation, so I thought it would be valuable for you to have that. You can submit your questions using the Q&A feature found in the Brand Live program here. You can see the red arrow pointed there. And again, I encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation. For technical issues, please use the chat. If your technical issue is not being addressed there, by all means, use event support and the sitemgroup.com. I'm getting a message that there's no sound. So just want to be okay. Maybe I'll just turn up my mic volume. Hopefully that helps. If I can get a couple of thumbs up, maybe in Slido in the Q&A.
I can confirm that you're audible in Brand Live.
Oh, okay, very good. Great, thank you. All right, and so then also to view questions, go to Slido, type in the code for this particular session, which is 000102, and then you should be good. So going back to the beginning here, our subtitle for today's presentation. Many subtitles were considered for today's presentation, but ultimately, what it comes down to is this. HUD wants what you want. The win-win is if you, as a grantee, are operating an organized, efficient, and well-performing program that's achieving measurable results. And if HUD is able to accurately document and reflect that in its systems. So that's the win-win we're going for in CDBG-CV monitoring. So today's outline, presentation outline, this is basically what we're going to be talking about. When it comes to the 5 W's of monitoring, we're going to be focusing on 3 of those. It's going to be the what, the why, and the how for HUD monitoring. And we'll review the steps that HUD and your CPD representative will follow. What we refer to as our 7-step monitoring process. And we'll show you how to best prepare for your monitoring visit. We'll also review some monitoring tips. Throughout the course of the presentation, you'll see some slides with a light bulb on them. Those will present monitoring tips for you as a grantee in preparing for monitoring. Some of the things that we share today may come as a surprise to you. Others may seem routine, but all of them are important. Our learning objectives. Well, there are several learning objectives that we have for today's session, but there are, here are the top 4, if you will, for us today. And I think these 4 here that are listed on the slide can be summarized to say that monitoring is not a one-off. It is not something that you concern yourself with for a season, for only the week that HUD is in town during a monitoring visit, or for when you get a letter from HUD for which you're asked to provide a response. It is something much more than that, and the best grantees understand that. So let's begin with the first of our W's. What? One definition, monitoring is an ongoing process that assesses the quality of a grantee's performance over a period of time. There's a more detailed definition found in Chapter 1 of the CPD Monitoring Handbook. Monitoring provides information about program participants that's critical for making informed judgments about program effectiveness and management efficiency. It also helps in identifying instances of fraud, waste, and abuse. To say that it is ongoing is to say that it's continuous. It is one of several internal controls at your disposal for you to employ in managing your program, your expenditure of program funds, your accounts, and your subrecipients. So monitoring isn't just something that HUD does to you. And to gain a better understanding of what monitoring is, it helps to understand as well what it is not. So as I said just now, monitoring is a continuous control. Generally, a monitor looks at a system that is set up by established policies and procedures. And that could be a CDBG-CV grant. It could be a power plant. It could be a hospital. And what the monitoring does, it establishes processes to ensure that the system continues to operate at peak efficiency and that risks to that operation are minimized. Larger grantees, especially states, may even have a whole grant compliance function as part of how they are organized. A chief compliance officer, if you will. It's important for you, though, as the day-to-day program manager, as the day-to-day grant program manager, to be handling the monitoring function, though. Don't slough off monitoring to the compliance division or to some internal audit division within your jurisdiction. You need to be understanding of monitoring and what it is. And some activities that qualify as monitoring activities, you may not even recognize as such. For instance, your attendance at this training is part of your monitoring responsibilities. By attending this training, you're keeping up to date on the latest development with HUD CPD programs. So that's monitoring. So as I said, some of the things you're doing in the daily administration of your program is monitoring, even if you don't recognize it as such. You're keeping current with changes in HUD rules, regulations, applicable laws, and federal requirements, developing internal controls, policies and procedures to comply with them. You're training staff on these rules, and you're taking steps in monitoring or verifying compliance with these new guidelines. Monitoring programs should be designed to test for inconsistencies, duplication, errors, policy violations, missing approvals, incomplete data, dollar or volume limit errors, or other possible breakdowns in internal controls. And monitoring techniques may include sampling protocols that permit program managers to identify and review variations from an established baseline. So let's get to the next W, why? Why does HUD monitor? Well, it's required by our statutes and regulations, of course. The Housing and Community Development Act requires the Secretary to conduct performance reviews annually. And many of the Section 104E provisions are addressed in detail in Part 570, Subpart O, performance reviews. The grant administration section of our regulations also addresses these responsibilities. And 570-501B contains the monitoring clause. This makes the recipient also responsible for determining the adequacy of performance under subrecipient agreements and procurement contracts, and for taking appropriate action when performance problems arise, such as actions outlined in 570-910 under Subpart O. But, here's the but. There are two reasons practically why HUD, and particularly CPD, is so concerned about monitoring. One is the very nature of our programs. HUD, and particularly CPD, differs from other federal agencies in that most of our grant funds are handled on a pass-through basis. CDBG is a pass-through grant program. That means that Congress appropriates the funding to HUD, but HUD does not directly administer the grant programs. Instead, we grant the money to other entities that actually are responsible for program implementation. That in itself is considered an inherently higher risk because we are relying on other entities to comply with program requirements. The other reason listed here is HUD history. The GAO in 1994 designated HUD as a high-risk agency, and at that time, the HUD was the only cabinet-level agency so designated. What were some of the things that the GAO found at that time? They noted our failure to establish monitoring policies and procedures, to follow them. We had established monitoring policies and procedures, but they weren't being followed. Inadequate documentation or information systems that did not provide accurate, reliable, or timely information for monitoring purposes. Inadequate training, staffing, and travel. Inadequate headquarters oversight of field operations and compliance monitoring. What HUD did would establish the following guidebooks, handbooks, and systems in response to the GAO. IDIS, for instance, was developed and implemented in 1996. And since that time, it's been enhanced regularly. So HUD has been in the practice since that 1994 report by GAO to improve its monitoring systems and is constantly at work at improving the monitoring response and activities of its grantees. So we always see room for improvement in our monitoring and with our grantees and their monitoring. Let's get into the how now. How does HUD monitor? Well, first of all, it's risk-based. As we indicated, as a pass-through program, CDBG is considered inherently higher risk. And CPD's monitoring policies and program-specific guidance is found in the CPD Monitoring Handbook. The link there is on the page of the handbook. Chapter 2 was included in your attachments. You might want to say, you know, why is it risk-based? Well, it's risk-based as well because while we do monitor the performance of grantees every year through action plan, CAPER, and timeliness reviews, we do not have the resources to monitor every single grantee and every single grant every year. So that's why grantees are scored and assessed in accordance with several risk factors and sub-factors that include program and financial management. So here is CPD's 7-step monitoring process. And we're going to spend a little bit of time going through the 7-step monitoring process, each one of these 7 steps, before we get into how you can respond. A question came up in the chat as to what is the GAO? Good question. They have changed their names over the years. Back in 1994, it was the government, it was then the General Accounting Office. Today, they are known as the Government Accountability Office, but that is the GAO. They are the overarching agency that sets forth standards for establishing risk analyses as well, which we'll get into when we provide some of the structural basis for the CPD Monitoring Handbook. Let's start with step 1, the risk analysis. I'm not going to read through these slides, but I want to know a couple of things from the information on this slide. Note here the factors upon which a CDBG assessment is based. Now you'll know, and I'll note this later as well, we do not have at the present time a risk analysis notice for FY22. The current risk analysis notice, CPD notice 1404, is the notice that is current and available and is currently active and what you should be using until it's superseded by a subsequent notice. And we are working on that subsequent notice as we speak. But until then, you should rely on CPD 1404. And within CPD 1404, the department has a 5-factor risk framework. For CDBG, there are only 3 factors upon which our monitoring is based: grant management, financial management, and services and satisfaction factor. So you can probably expect that the forthcoming risk analysis notice, those same 3 factors will be applied to not only CDBG, but to CDBG-CV. So the risk factors are applied for each of to each of your grants, each of your programs, and a 100-point scale is used. And depending upon the availability of travel resources, whether HUD will even be going out and doing on-site monitoring this year, which is a question, HUD may also monitor grantees that do not score near the top of the 100-point scale. That is subject to the discretion of the CPD manager in your particular field office. But Please note that whether we do on-site or remote monitoring, you can use remote monitoring, for instance, also to monitor non-high-risk grantees. So once the risk analysis is completed, we go from risk to monitoring. And what is so our guidebook, our handbook, is the CPD monitoring handbook. HUD's prep for monitoring is based on the procedures and standards set forth in the monitoring handbook. So it's useful for you as a grantee to understand this guidebook, this handbook, become familiar with how it's organized, because it's what HUD is going to be using. The structure of the handbook, chapters 1 and 2, base overview, definitions, and our basic monitoring construct. If there's no other part of the monitoring handbook that you can read and prepare for prior to monitoring, I would encourage you just to at least read chapters 1 and 2 to prepare yourself for what that monitoring visit is going to be like. Chapters 3 through 18 and 28 through 33, they contain program-specific monitoring guidance. 19 to 27 shows the technical areas for monitoring. Chapter 34 covers the uniform administrative requirements, what we will also refer to as the uniform guidance from Part 200. And that will apply for all programs. And please note that the handbook is a living document. It is changed or revised as circumstances dictate. 6 chapters have even been removed since 2005. And there's a chapter there reserved for closeouts. A question was asked, is there an ETA for the subsequent notice release date? No, there's not. Sorry about that, but it's still in production, and we don't have that available at this time. Thanks for the question. So a few key handbook highlights from chapter 1, the definition of monitoring terms. If you ever receive correspondence from HUD and you don't know what they're talking about because they're using terms you're not familiar with, go to chapter 1. They can help you understand a word used in any monitoring correspondence with HUD. Both chapter 3 and chapter 4, the CDBG entitlement and the CDBG state chapters, they have pertinent introductory text at the front of each of those chapters. Don't just reference the exhibits in chapters 3 and 4, but refer to the introductory text because that will help you. Because again, those are instructions for HUD staff on how to use the exhibits. So the more you know of how HUD is going to operate, the better prepared you will be for monitoring. So step 2 is your monitoring strategy. There's a lot here in terms of what HUD is going to do in terms of putting together its strategy. I want to focus really on the last bullet point noted here. And that is that HUD staff will use a similar attachment to attachment E1 of CPD Notice 1404. So the forthcoming risk analysis notice, there will be a similar attachment. And they will use that attachment to select the exhibits that most closely correlate to the identified risks. So you might want to look at that attachment E1 to the current notice and see how, when you do your own self-assessment, how your program lines up. And yes, of course, the monitoring checklists are in the handbook. We'll get into that. The links to the handbook are there. yes, there are timestamps for changes to the monitoring handbook, and the way that is done is essentially by HUD providing previous versions of the monitoring handbook at the bottom of the page where you find the monitoring handbook. Thanks. So the grantee notification letter, step 3 of HUD's 7-step process. Again, I'm referring you to section 2.7a, chapter 2 of the CPD monitoring handbook. Become familiar with that chapter. It details exactly what's going to happen. The question here at the bottom of the slide, is often posed to us. What's the difference between on-site or remote monitoring? And the processes are essentially the same, with the exception of location and the information that would be requested to be submitted to HUD in the notification letter if it is a remote monitoring, right? So the notification letter then also, if you note here on this last bullet point, they go out at least 2 weeks prior to monitoring. HUD's goal is always to 2 weeks is the minimum amount of time, but we try to maximize that time period to allow you to prepare, to allow HUD to prepare for the monitoring visit. So pre-monitoring preparation. This is the time period that HUD staff devote to diving in a little deeper on your program. They spend this time trying to learn about your activities, how you're structured, who's involved in your program, and how you've performed in the past. They will request certain information from you in advance based on the programs that they are monitoring. So for instance, if they're monitoring your CDBG-CV loan fund for small businesses downtown. For instance, the CPD rep may request ahead of time your written underwriting criteria, or the loan fund's policies and procedures, or a list of the members of the loan committee. They may request boilerplate loan agreements to review ahead of time, and any marketing materials that you made available for this loan fund. And they will also review the exhibits that they're using. I would not say that they are going to put you under a microscope, but it's a time period for them to prepare for whatever may occur during the monitoring based on the programs that they will be reviewing. CPD reps, they have many responsibilities with many grantees across multiple programs and multiple program areas within CPD. So this time is also a time for them to remind themselves about you, if they've been working with other grantees recently, or in other CPD programs, or even to get up to speed if they're new to you as a grantee. So the question was asked in the chat, will there be specific monitoring notice on CDBG-CV, or will the notice cover all CPD funding? The notice is going to be covering all CPD funding, the risk analysis notice. There are going to be a couple of exceptions, I believe, which I'm not going to speak to. I can say CDBG-CV will be included, and that you can be certain of. Thanks. So conducting the monitoring, step 5. When the day arrives, whether it is, again, in person or remote, conducting the monitoring consists essentially of 3 parts: the entrance conference, the actual assessment, and the exit conference. So we're going to spend some time going through each of these. The entrance conference is essentially a follow-up and confirmation of much of the information in the notification letter. The entrance conference, basically, time will be spent confirming a schedule of interviews or setting up the schedule of interviews during the period of the monitoring, and other logistics for the monitoring are confirmed. Where the files are located, how they're to be accessed, how they're to be handled, with regard to PII, et cetera, and so forth. The assessment process. This is where the real work of the HUD monitoring process occurs. And what we like to say is to our HUD staff is you need to evaluate, communicate, document, and then repeat. Rinse and repeat. That's basically what we're telling them to do. And again, if you want to know the procedures that the HUD staff will be following, check out Chapter 2 of the CPD Monitoring Handbook. That is a very valuable chapter. And this assessment process, it consists of all of these things. There is a question in the chat, which I'm going to try to address real quickly here. Oh, a couple of questions. Okay, let me pause here to address a couple of questions in the chat. Due to the ongoing pandemic, is HUD okay with remote monitorings for the foreseeable future? Well, again, as I indicated, HUD does not see remote monitorings as a substitute for on-site monitorings. They are at the same playing field. So if we engage in remote monitoring for the foreseeable future, then we see no difference between that and on-site monitoring. We would expect grantee preparation and performance and HUD's own preparation and performance to be indistinguishable for remote monitoring from an on-site monitoring. Is the completed risk analysis tool shared with grantees? So the risk analysis notice is a public notice. CPD notice 1404, you can go and you can check it out right now if you like. It's available on HUD Clips. It's a very transparent process. The last question I see here in the chat, I understand grantees should have their own risk analysis for determining monitoring visits. Can you explain how that functions with CV funds? Should that policy be updated to address CV only funding? You should have your own monitoring plan and strategy in place for your own programs or for your subrecipients. We will get into that. We're going to be getting a little bit more into that. You're a little bit ahead of me right now with this question, but we're also going to be getting into subrecipient monitoring later in the week. Our last session on Friday, as part of the Basically CDBG course, we'll cover that. Okay, so back to the assessment process. This is information that is provided to HUD staff in terms of how the assessment process is to proceed. It's useful for you to review as a grantee so that you know how HUD is going to be relying not just on file reviews, but also interviews and also site inspections if the opportunity is available. But the file reviews are the essential part of the process. So finally, after this monitoring process is concluded, there is the exit conference. And the exit conference is really our opportunity to present preliminary conclusions, to confirm the accuracy or completeness of information, for us to make some determinations, identify areas of disagreement with you, the grantee. You'll see there those 5 sub-bullet points. These are some of the different monitoring results that can result from the monitoring process. Performance is adequate or exemplary. There are significant achievements. Concerns have been identified. Technical assistance is needed or was provided. Findings have been identified which require corrective actions. So again, this is a tip which doesn't have a light bulb attached to it, but you'll note here on the third bullet point that HUD staff are instructed to use Exhibit 2.1 to organize their conclusions. For you, when you're conducting a self-review or monitoring your subrecipients, you may want to use the same exhibit, Exhibit 2-1, to organize your own conclusions. Just a helpful tip in terms of you monitoring your own grantees or your own subrecipients. The exit conference is also another opportunity for you to submit additional information before a monitoring letter or report is issued. HUD has a significant time window from the exit conference to their deadline for issuing a monitoring report. The exit conference may be an opportunity for you to submit additional information that would amend or maybe even close a finding that HUD has identified during the course of the monitoring. So this is an important opportunity for you during the exit conference. One of the things that we like to talk about in any monitoring training is HUD's use of sampling. As we indicated, HUD cannot possibly monitor every grant program and every grantee every year. So whereas we rely on a risk-based 100-point scale score to determine who are the highest risk grantees that we ought to monitor, we also rely on sampling when we're on site to help us make conclusions about the activities which we're reviewing. Samples can be random, non-random, or they can be statistically valid. And I've highlighted in bold font here the bullet point regarding statistically valid random samples. Such samples will allow HUD to generalize results to the activity as a whole. It's important that you understand HUD's sampling process and that you understand how HUD is going to be going about reviewing your CDBG-CV activities. In all likelihood, for most grantees at this stage in CDBG-CV implementation, there may not be enough of a database, if you will, within a particular file, within a particular program, to do a statistically valid random sample. Really depends. It's a case-by-case basis with each of your programs. So just be mindful of that. Okay, I see we have a couple more questions here in the chat. We do have a resource that's been posted into the chat for risk analyses, the current notice that's also available on the HUD Exchange. It's also available on HUD Clips. HOPWA, there will be a HOPWA session after this. I'm not going to address that question. How can I find the agency that works with HUD programs at NYC? Well, you'd have to contact them. Can monitoring findings still be noted or issued after the exit conference? Certainly, yeah. The exit conference is an opportunity to put forth HUD's general observations. We do like to note, based upon the assessment, the findings that occurred, but HUD's review doesn't end with the exit conference. And so monitoring findings could still be noted after the exit conference in a monitoring letter. Will there be a 5-minute intermission during this training? I don't think so. How is HUD changing standards for client interviews during the pandemic? Again, client interviews is something that is probably done as part of an on-site review. You'll note, again, from our review earlier of some of the components of a CPD monitoring handbook, that a question within the monitoring exhibits that is marked OS, those are questions that can only be answered on site. We'll alert you as to how client interviews will be handled after the risk analysis notice is published. What is a statistically valid random sample? I'm not going to get into sampling here. You can find out more about sampling within the CPD monitoring handbook. Yeah, I'm not going to get into those questions. What is the impact of there not being enough data point to be significant? Well, it means that, let's say, if you have a business, the example I used earlier of a small business loan program for downtown businesses to provide support during the pandemic. If you've only made loans to 2 businesses, HUD's probably just is going to review those 2 files. You know, if you've made, what HUD will do is it will tailor its assessment to the time available and to the data to go through, and we'll use sampling accordingly. You know, but if this is a major component of your CDBG-CV program and HUD is monitoring it, and you've only made 2 loans, HUD's probably going to look at both loans. We're not going to look at one and skip the other. We'll probably look at both of them, especially because it's a major component of your CDBG-CV program. So, all right. So there's more there about monitoring and sampling. Again, I would refer you to the CPD monitoring handbook on that. Okay, follow-up, what you should expect from HUD. You know, for any findings, we'll set forth reasonable timeframes for your response. HUD will follow up in writing or by telephone if a deadline has passed and we haven't heard from you. And either form of contact will be documented by HUD. It's important for you to note that. If the grantee submits information to clear a finding, HUD will review it within 15 working days and respond in writing to the grantee within 30 calendar days, whether the response is acceptable or not. And again, that standard of performance for the HUD employee, that's set forth, once again, Chapter 2, CPD Monitoring Handbook. Become very familiar with it. All right, so now that I know HUD steps, what HUD is going to do, how do I prepare for a monitoring visit? Well, typically, again, as I briefly alluded to at the top of this presentation, you would refer to the monitoring exhibits for your particular CPD program to conduct a self-review. Well, those are still in production, along with the risk analysis notice that is coming out. So that doesn't mean, however, that absent these documents, you can't prepare. You definitely can. So here's are some of the things you might want to do. Here's our monitoring tip number 1. IDIS data cleanup. Remember what we said at the top of this presentation, that monitoring is a continuous, ongoing process. Months before a HUD monitoring visit, you set up your activities in IDIS. Look at your activity setup and accomplishment screens and complete and conduct a data cleanup. Complete any missing information. If you left the narrative box blank in your IDIS setup screens, because it's not applicable, mark it NA. Don't leave it blank. Nobody knows how to interpret a blank. Refer to the IDIS guidance on the HUD Exchange for how to complete the activity setup and accomplishment screens. Most of all, be sure when you provide a narrative description of your project, be sure to provide a succinct narrative description that describes the activity and also includes the PPR tieback to coronavirus. Prepare, prevent, and respond to coronavirus. Discuss that in the narrative description of your activity. So with regard to IDIS data cleanup and regarding CDBG-CV, here is what we're seeing nationally as some of the common CDBG-CV data entry and activity setup mistakes. We know, for instance, that many CDBG-CV grantees are engaged in economic development assistance for the first time with their CDBG-CV funds. Each grant or loan to a business should be in a separate file and should be entered in IDIS as a separate activity. The ED loan program can be an IDIS project, if you will, but the loans to a distinct business should be a separate activity. Many grantees are also engaged very heavily for the first time in public services. Do not lump all your public services into one public service activity. Even those activities for which you may have 2 or more subrecipients engaged in the same activity and delivering services, they should be separated out into separate activities, a different one for each subrecipient. Think about the various public service activities you're engaged in with CV funds and set them up as separate projects in IDIS if warranted. Finally, be careful with how you are managing compliance with the public services cap. If you have inadvertently spent 2015 and 2016 or even 2018, whatever, funds on PPR activities, and that has put you over the cap, revise those vouchers and draw those funds down from the appropriate grant years. Remember, the only annual formula funds with PPR tieback to coronavirus that are not subject to the public services cap are 2019 and 2020 funds. Okay, so we had a question here about what is IDIS. IDIS is the Integrated Disbursement and Information System. It is a management information system that HUD relies upon for grantee reporting. So you're reporting on your grant, and your means actually of accessing your grant funds is also done through IDIS. Is there a maximum time frame where a grantee can request an extension to respond to HUD's monitoring report? I would say the time frame for an extension is handled on a case-by-case basis, and that would have to be circumstances beyond, in most cases, circumstances beyond the grantee's control. There was something that came up, there was some natural disaster, there was something that was beyond the grantee's control that prevented them from responding in a timely fashion to HUD. But that will be handled on a case-by-case basis with each grantee within each field office. Okay, let's go to another monitoring tip. The PR59 at-risk activities report. So this is a very helpful report for those of you who maybe you got out of the gate very early with the expenditure of your CDBG-CV funds, but you stalled. You haven't really prosecuted and carried out the grant as quickly as you would have liked. And some activities have stalled for one reason or another. So use this report, download this report, and see where those activities are, and address those activities. Complete the remediation plans. Address even those activities that are pending at risk. And use these other, and also use these other reports listed here in IDIS to monitor your progress with your CDBG-CV activities. All 4 of those listed there are very valuable. If you have CDBG-CV activities that don't generate any program income, PRO 9 would not be applicable, but the other ones here are very valuable for you to monitor any roadblocks, any bottlenecks in terms of expenditure of CDBG-CV funds and the implementation of your activities. All right, we have another tip here. Conduct a self-review. I've hinted at this a couple times earlier in this presentation, but using the exhibits that most closely relate to your CDBG-CV program, determine whether you can answer the questions positively based on the information that is found in the project file, in the activity file. Your self-review should meet a reasonable person standard. If a reasonable person cannot understand how your files are documenting eligibility and national objective, for instance, and how they're organized, then neither can HUD. It's always helpful, no matter the size of your program, to put file checklists and put them at the front of each file to guide a reviewer through the file's contents. You should be able to answer yes to every applicable requirement found in the exhibit questions, and answer of no where a statutory or regulatory citation is noted will result in a finding of noncompliance. So as you're doing your self-review, don't just go to those exhibits. Read the introductory instructions for each exhibit. Read the introductory instructions to Chapter 3 and to Chapter 4. Often they will refer to other exhibits that need to be completed, and your self-review should include those exhibits as well. I'm going to pause here for a second to answer a couple more questions in the chat. The 3-year clock, it does start on the grant agreement execution date of your first round of funding. So if, like a state grantee, you received 3 tranches of CDBG-CV funds, HUD would go by the date on the first grant agreement. That's when the clock starts for the 3 years. The next question here, if we're providing funds to an UGLUG, a unit of local government, to reimburse multiple businesses for measures taken in response to COVID, do we have to put info on each business in IDIS, or since it is one grant to the UGLUG, can we aggregate the amounts? So the UGLUG is your subrecipient, the unit of general local government. It's up to them, the UGLUG, to separate each one of those files and assistance out in its files. Your relationship is not with those businesses. Your relationship is with that UGLUG. So that UGLUG can do that in IDIS, but they should have that separated out within their records. So that I think should address that question. I will get into the 3-year requirement. I can't tell you what will happen if it's not met, but we're going to be talking about the 3-year requirement later in this presentation. Okay, so moving on here. Speaking about your files. So your files, just like for HUD staff, the assessment is the meat of the monitoring visit. Your files are where the rubber meets the road during a HUD monitoring visit. So it's going to be the core activity that HUD staff will engage in during your assessment. So let's spend a minute talking about record keeping and documentation. You want to know what's important. The monitoring exhibit will tell you that. And we've talked about the self-review that you can conduct absent the CDBG-CV monitoring exhibits that are still in production. But where else can you go to know what's important to document, especially with regard to CDBG-CV specifically? Well, I've listed some items here to guide you. This list is not exhaustive, but I'll call out a few items to review for each one of these on the next few slides. And if you pay attention to these, you should be in good shape. Obviously, the CARES Act. The Community Development Fund section of the CARES Act, wherein CDBG-CV funds are outlined, is less than 3 full pages. In addition to reading Chapter 2 of the CPD Monitoring Handbook, you should read the Community Development Fund section of the Act. Again, less than 3 full pages. Click on that link. Click on the PDF to download it. There's the reference as to which pages it is. You can find the Community Development Fund section within the Act. Note the emphasis that Congress put here on duplication of benefits. That's important because if Congress put an emphasis on it, our friends at the GAO are putting an emphasis on it. Our friends at the Office of Inspector General are putting an emphasis on it. So be aware of that within the language of the Act itself. The CDBG-CV notice and the notice FAQs. There's a link there on the screen that you can see for those. I did want to point out one thing about eligible activities found in the CDBG-CV notice. The notice itself, it was issued in August of 2020, and it addresses several items of note, including your use of CDBG-CV funds in conjunction with other CDBG funding. But it's important that you become familiar, whether you're new to your position or whether you've been serving in your jurisdiction for a long time. It's important that you become familiar with the terms of the CDBG-CV notice. The FAQs, they provide a good, easy to understand walkthrough of the notice. So it would be good to review them before the monitoring visit, especially if it's been a while, if it's been over a year since you've taken a look at those. We want to make sure that you also note the following caution. And again, this is found in section 3B5F, eligible activities of the CDBG-CV notice. And I'm going to highlight this, the last bit of language here, which I've highlighted in bold. HUD cautions grantees that the record-keeping requirements of this notice require clear documentation that all uses of funds satisfy the statutory purposes of the CARES Act. So that right there, you have our caution that your record keeping needs to meet the standards and satisfy the purposes of the CARES Act. Something else I want to point out to you is the special conditions included with your CDBG-CV grant agreement. Your signature on that grant agreement is your agreement to these special conditions. The special condition number 4 is with regard to duplication of benefits. Do you have adequate procedures in place to prevent any duplication of benefits? That's a specific special condition that's been added to your grant agreement. So, monitoring tip time here again. One thing that you can do, again, without having the CDBG-CV monitoring exhibits available to you, use the current monitoring exhibits that reference duplication of benefits requirements and conduct a DOB self-review. Look at Exhibit 611 in the CPD Monitoring Handbook and refer to questions 6 through 9 in Section B. There's not a one-to-one correspondence, obviously, here with CDBG-CV. This is a CDBG-DR exhibit, but in lieu of actually having available to you right now a CDBG-CV monitoring exhibit at your, this is better than nothing. So conduct a DOB self-review by asking the same questions posed there of your own CDBG-CV program. So CDBG's record keeping and managing subrecipient guidance. This also is very useful to have. Reference our 2 key regs, 24 CFR 570-502 on uniform guidance and 506 on record keeping. Do a check of your subrecipient agreements. Does each of our subrecipient agreements meet at a minimum the regulatory standard found in 24 CFR 570-503? If you need to make amendments to those agreements to make them compliant, make them now. Don't wait. Don't wait for, if you know that there are instances of non-compliance with a subrecipient agreement or with anything else, show your good faith subsequent to this training to make those changes and then to bring your program into compliance upon completion of your self-review prior to a HUD monitoring visit. That will go a long way in showing your good faith efforts to operate a well-organized and compliant program. Okay, and another monitoring tip, use the subrecipient management guidebooks. These guidebooks were both recently updated. They were posted to the HUD Exchange last month, managing CDBG and playing by the rules. Those guidebooks have a wealth of information that will help you not only in managing your subrecipients, but in performing the same types of reviews and checks on your own program. As I indicated, both of these guidebooks just went through a long overdue refresh. And again, that was posted last month to the HUD Exchange. So go there, look at them, use them, perform your own self-review by thinking of, by using some of the tools and the tips and the resources and the checklists presented in those guidebooks. Obviously, documenting PPR tieback is going to be critical. We've already noted that the GAO and the Office of Inspector General at HUD are keenly interested in the use of these funds. So just a couple of things I want to note for you here from the CDBG-CV notice. What we indicated, and we've repeated this on several occasions, but it bears repeating here. Some activities clearly tie back to the purposes of the CARES Act. Public services, economic development, microenterprise assistance, etc. However, HUD is not prohibiting grantees from carrying out any particular CDBG eligible activity described in the Housing and Community Development Act. and in our Part 570 regulations. Because other CDBG eligible activities, such as acquisition, can justifiably be used to fulfill the CARES Act purposes, depending upon the circumstances. So we understand that each one of you is unique, and you have situations within your jurisdiction that may require what may be considered by some an uncommon response to the pandemic. Be clear to record your application of PPR tieback to that activity and in your documentation of that tieback. Another tip here, how to really best do that. Use the PPR tieback quick guides. They will help further direct you and help you determine whether the tieback that you've documented is reasonable. The April 30th, 2021 quick guide, the link is shown on the screen, but you can also go to the HUD Exchange and find that resource fairly quickly. You can also find it at HUD.gov among the COVID-19 resources for CPD and CDBG programs. And the April 9th quick guide listed there as well. Finally, we want to refer you to the Part 200, the administrative requirements, otherwise known as the uniform guidance. Refer to 570-502 to determine how that applies to CDBG and CDBG-CV. Remember that any costs that you incur for any CPD grant must be reasonable, allowable, and allocable. Specific cost allowability, that can be found in subpart E, cost principles of Part 200. And the additional clarification of the applicability of the Part 200 requirements and how they apply to the use of CDBG-CV funds, that's also found in the CDBG-CV notice. I'm going to pause here before I get into the information on this slide and answer some questions in the chat. I see we got two here. At the beginning of CV funding, we drafted DOB policies and procedures. We requested feedback on our DOB policies and procedures. Should we submit to AAQ for feedback? No, not necessarily. HUD can provide advice, but we're not going to provide approval of a set of policies and procedures. Your feedback that you provide or ask for from your CPD rep or from your local HUD field office, that is something that HUD can provide advice on, but we won't provide approval on. So I'm not, so, you know, they should be able to give you some advice and point you in the right direction. There are many resources indicated in the prior session and this session and throughout this week, actually, that are going to be repeated over and over about duplication of benefits and the resources available to you to establish duplication of benefit policies and procedures. So I will leave that at that. Housing emergency assistance program to tenants. Do these need to be set up individually as activities in IDIS or under one activity? So if you're doing what we like to call in CDBG, not rental assistance, but emergency grant payments, if you're using CDBG-CV for emergency grant payments, and you're providing payments to landlords for rent as part of that assistance, you may set it up several different ways. So emergency grant payments are payments to a third party, not directly to the beneficiary. If you're dealing with, let's say, 10 different landlords, you may set up each activity as a separate landlord, for instance. You could set it up as a separate activity for each tenant, and have the landlord in your IDIS activity setup, have that landlord be, quote, the project in IDIS. Depending upon the scope of your program and how it's set up, I would seek advice from your CPD rep in terms of how to set that up. But I don't think I would set it up as just one huge whole activity. That's what we're trying to get away from, and is not helpful in terms of understanding the scope of your program and meeting the reporting requirements. Can CDBG-CV funds be used to cover the rent of a facility which provides services to individuals with mental disabilities? No CDBG-CV funds. Again, you need to document PPR tieback. If you are able to do that adequately, any activity can have CDBG-CV funds applied to it. Nonprofit agencies are able to charge a 10% de minimis rate of modified total direct costs in lieu of an approved indirect allocation plan. Is that correct? Yeah, the 10% de minimis rate for indirect costs is allowable. Refer to Part 200 for more about the 10% de minimis rate. And I think there is actually more information within the CDBG-CV notice about that as well. Is there a HUD compliance contact team that can also help advise PJs while building risk assessments? So you're using home dollars and CDBG dollars in conjunction to address coronavirus. Again, your contact, your primary contact is your CPD rep within your particular field office with regard to advice about your CDBG-CV program. Thank you. We developed forms before calculators were available. All right, that's good. Okay. To clarify, we could set up a project for the emergency assistance and then set up each tenant landlord as an activity. I think that is one route to go, but I think I would, if this is a major piece of your CDBG-CV assistance, I would have that conversation with the CPD rep and say, this is the way we're looking at it. This is how many individuals, beneficiaries, landlords, what have you, that we're talking about. Get an understanding of how best to set it up, but in consultation with them. When will you provide agendas for basically CDBG training sessions 1 and 2? So I think those are forthcoming. Those sessions are Wednesday through Friday of this week. So if they are not on the registration, the website, then they should be forthcoming. All right. So let me get back to the presentation. I'm just going to do a time check here. We're at 12:30. We are going through 1:15, and at 1:15 we have a lunch break. I think we are really good right now in terms of timing of this presentation. So there is ample opportunity for a Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation. So if you have additional questions, and they can be answered at that point, please hold them until the end of the presentation. Other resources that you can be using to prepare right now for CDBG-CV monitoring. Well, one, And this may be somewhat obvious, but there is a CPD monitoring page on the HUD Exchange. If you go to the home programs and then CPD monitoring, or if you just Google CPD monitoring, you'll find a link to the CPD monitoring page. This is a snip of a screenshot from that page. And it provides not only information on a monitoring overview, but information on other CPD grant programs, not just CDBG, in the left-hand margin. And one resource in particular that I want to highlight on this page are the links to the HUD integrity bulletins. Let me just, oops. If I can use my highlighter here. These HUD integrity bulletins, refer to those. These were produced mostly in 2016 as a result of a joint effort between CPD and the HUD Inspector General. And there are some valuable quick guides to you on areas of that CPD had that was of mutual interest between CPD and OIG. So some of the topics there include procurement and contracting, subrecipient oversight, conflicts of interest, internal controls, documentation and reporting, and financial management. So I would encourage you to go to those and utilize those integrity bulletins. Some very helpful information that again, common between us and the IG, the Inspector General. Addressing common concerns, if you will. Okay, what are some other resources that I can use to prepare right now? Well, obviously, your relationships with other grantees and grantee networks, those are critical. Whether you're a member of NCDA or the National Community Development Association, or ACOSTA, the Council of State Community Development Agencies, NACED, the National Association of County Community Economic Development, any in one of those organizations and any informal grantee networks have resources to assist you in preparing for monitoring. So lean into those relationships with other grantees and grantee networks. Even if you're not a member of one of those national associations, you may be part of a local state network that's not affiliated with one of those groups. Lean into those relationships, and those are very helpful in preparing for monitoring. I can remember just a little bit about my own background. I was a HUD grantee for several years, and would definitely rely on those networks and my relationship with other nearby entitlements and their staff, especially when it came to monitoring. I would get calls and I would send calls to those people and say, hey, just FYI, a HUD is coming and they wanted to take a look at the airport map. I worked for a grantee that had a regional airport, and as part of environmental monitoring and as part of your environmental review file, you should have a copy of the airport map within your files, within your environmental review files, especially if you have activities in the vicinity of that regional airport that may be affected by sound, et cetera, and so forth, noise. I received a heads up from a nearby grantee that said, hey, HUD's coming to monitor and you better make sure that you have that map in your file. And by the way, the flight path for this airport went into this grantee's or went over this grantee's jurisdiction. And so he was looking for a copy of that map because he didn't have it. Luckily, I had it. It was in my file. It was in my environmental review file. But that kind of sharing of information back and forth to making sure that your files are complete, that's always very helpful. So really lean into those grantee networks, formal and informal. Again, I've noted here CPD Notice 1404. That is our current notice until superseded by the forthcoming risk analysis notice. I say here for monitoring geeks, and that is because you know, you may be aware by reading this notice of how you're being scored, but it's much more valuable for you as a local CDBG program manager to focus on the CPD monitoring handbook. This kind of dives into the weeds about the score that's produced via the risk analysis process. I don't know if it's that helpful for the everyday CDBG program manager, but if you're really into monitoring, by all means, reference that notice. So I think I've said enough about these two resources. I'm going to move on here. So let me just review all those slides that had the light bulbs on them. Conduct that IDIS data cleanup. Use the PR59 and your other IDIS reports to do that cleanup. Conduct a self-review of your CDBG-CV program using the currently available monitoring exhibits. Do a DOB review using Exhibit 611, those questions within Exhibit 611 that address duplication of benefits. Use the recently updated subrecipient management guidebooks. Again, a wealth of resources there and checklists, especially regarding monitoring and subrecipient monitoring, obviously. And then use the quick guides to check your PPR tieback, to check to see if it's reasonable, if it meets the reasonable person standard. Okay, this would be a good time to do a check of some of the questions that we have in the chat. So I'll try to answer some of those. There was a technical question about sound. I hope that's not an issue. Emergency grant activity has involved about 50 some households and 35 or 40 landlords. And I've already drawn down the money in IDIS. Do I now need to go back and separate all of that into separate IDIS activities? It depends. And so I can't necessarily answer this question, but it depends. Let's say whether a subrecipient was involved in also engaged in this activity. I would say that you're okay for how you've set it up, but I might have that conversation with your CPD rep. 35 or 40 landlords does sound like a lot of landlords, and a larger grantee obviously may have that many landlords that they're working with. I would say that as long as you haven't grouped this emergency grant activity with another emergency grant activity that has slightly different guidelines or slightly different set of requirements, you should be okay in terms of how you set this up. But I think I would want to confirm that by just a quick call to your CPD rep and seeing how that is done. Questions asked here, please correct me if I'm wrong, but state CDBG programs enter activities and data into IDIS and not their entitlement UGLUG grantees that don't have IDIS access. That is correct. Yeah. But Some non-entitlement UGLUG grantees do have the ability to enter data into IDIS. They're given that ability. So it depends again on your state, your situation. All right, so let's move on here. So one more thing, and this is where we're going to talk about period of performance. And I'm sorry, but it needs to be said. It's not required this year, but it will be a concern, especially if you are not on pace to meet the 80% drawn in 3-year requirement. As we said, monitoring, continuous control. How do I manage my monitoring of my compliance with that period of performance expenditure requirement? Well, here's one suggestion. Use the template projected versus actual drawdown schedule spreadsheet at the back of the CDBG timeliness brochure. That is the brochure that's titled Developing and Implementing a CDBG Workout Plan. And use that spreadsheet to begin monitoring your compliance with this requirement, whether it's the 80% in 3-year requirement or the 100% in 6-year requirement. This brochure, it's used for your annual formula program for entitlement grantees. And the spreadsheet is used by those grantees when they implement and submit to HUD a workout plan for how they're going to be timely within the appropriate time frame. You can use that same spreadsheet to show how you're going to meet the expenditure requirements. So we're going to take a few minutes here to just briefly go through this spreadsheet. And I'm going to expand my screen here or zoom in on aspects of this so you can see this. So this is your funds projected and funds drawn, actual versus projected. This is set up on a monthly basis, as you can see. You might set yours up on a quarterly basis, especially if you want to show all on one sheet how you're going to meet the requirement within 3 years or 6 years time. Or you might even want to set up one with just 6 columns or semi-annually. However you do it, it's going to be easier for you. It's going to be easier for upper management within your jurisdiction to see it all on one spreadsheet, all on one sheet of paper, so they can quickly reference how we doing, where are the bottlenecks, what needs to get moving. Put the name of the activity, and again here, so you can have it all on one sheet. List all your public services to get activities together. Put all of your public facility activities together. Put all of your economic development activities together. Separate out the activities depending upon how your program is structured. If you're putting 50% of your money into this one public service activity and you have 5 or 6 other public service activities, don't group all the public services activities together. Take that one public service activity where 50% of your allocation is going and separate it out. Give it its own separate line item. So this spreadsheet, this template, it's found at the back of that brochure, Developing and Implementing a CDBG Workout Plan. And you set this up in Excel and you will be able to monitor your expenditure and your compliance with the deadline on an ongoing basis. That's just one way of monitoring your and some of the resources that HUD has available to you to help you monitor. So if you're not currently, or even if you are currently on pace to meet the 80% deadline and the 100% deadline. It would be good to set this up and use it to begin to monitor your compliance with those period of performance requirements. Okay. All right. And the link there is found right here within the HUD Exchange. So let's talk, before we get into our Q&A session, let's talk briefly about monitoring outcomes. You see from the slide there, those were the same bullet points that we had earlier when discussing what the outcomes would be from the exit conference. So going back to what we said there, it would be communicated at an exit conference. Remember that, again, you will have an opportunity at that conference to present additional information before a monitoring letter is issued. But what if there are findings? What if things are not compliant and there are deficiencies found for which findings must be made by HUD? What then? Well, here are a couple of key tips for you to follow in responding to any findings and concerns that HUD may have after the monitoring visit. First of all, this may be obvious, but be timely. And again, if there's some circumstance that's going to prevent you from being timely, let HUD know about that. Don't ignore the deadlines set by HUD. Demonstrate a good faith effort to resolve the findings and address the area of noncompliance. And if your head is swimming and you really don't know how to address this issue or how best to resolve it, and you need help, and by help I mean technical assistance, and it's not offered, raise your hand, ask for help. HUD wants to be a partner with you. And our goal in monitoring is for you to see HUD, your field office, your CPD representative, as a trusted advisor, that you can rely upon them to offer assistance and advice on the implementation of your CDBG program and your CDBGCV program. So by all means, lean into them. HUD is not going to come down on you, with a gotcha or a penalizing type of mentality. You're our partner in making sure that the congressional intent of the CDBGCV program is followed and is implemented, and that the program succeeds. So we do want to work with you on resolving findings and concerns. So ultimately, what should be my goal? Well, the good grantee. The good grantee, from a HUD perspective, they're well-performing and compliant. They're achieving measurable results in their program. They're organized, knowledgeable. They have easily accessible records that contain the information sought by HUD, and it's presented in a clear and logical fashion. They have the policies, the processes, and the staff in place to carry out the program. So that being said, strive for consistent improvement in strengthening and the execution of your internal controls, including monitoring. None of us, even among grantees with the most exemplary practices, none of us has reached the finish line. There's always room for improvement. And that's the story, you know, that's the same with CDBG as it is in life. So keep running the race, always strive for consistent improvement. And my best wishes to all of you in the upcoming monitoring season. So with that, I am going to open our session for questions. And I'll begin with some of the questions that haven't been addressed here in the chat. Public service programs fall into the same 3-year 80%. Yes, that is true. It's the period of performance is not a program-based period of performance, it's a funds-based. So your CDBG-CV grant is what the period of performance is applied to. Is there something similar to the CDBG workout plan that is automatic from IDIS? It's a little bit overwhelming to set up an Excel document and manually enter infill. True. Yeah. So this is where you rely on your grantee networks. Find out who else in your network has got that workout plan spreadsheet already set up, and say, hey, you mind sharing that with me? Talk to the finance director. Finance people, they should know how to set up a basic spreadsheet in Excel. Explain to them this period of performance requirement. Go through it with them. Share with them that that template, and see if you can get someone in your finance department to set this up for you. Explain how it's going to be useful to them, whether that is the finance director, the town manager, the county commissioners, whoever it may be. Explain how it's going to be useful to them to help them monitor compliance with the period performance requirement. So those are all excellent resources, I think, for putting together that Excel document if you're not that skilled with Excel. Microsoft Excel also has templates. Google projected versus actual drawdown of funds, and see what comes up. You may be surprised. You may find an Excel spreadsheet template that's available, that's on the internet for free. You never know. Those are all some suggestions that you could follow in terms of setting up that Excel spreadsheet. Okay, the next session after lunch, I think, is going to begin. Lunch is a half an hour, so I think the next session is beginning at 1:45. I think we actually might, depending upon the number of questions that come in here, we might give you an extended lunch. Some of you probably on the East Coast right now even are a little bit hangry. Okay, is the risk analysis document you mentioned, I scrolled back in the chat if you mentioned, see anything. Yes, the risk analysis document is not included in the monitoring handbook. That is found in the HUD Exchange and on HUD Clips. If you do back scroll through this chat, you will see a link that someone has provided to that document from the HUD Exchange, but it is also in HUD Clips. Okay, and I see we've got some of the questions here right now. Our folks, our friends at CDM have set this up here. Please share the link to the CDBG work plan. Okay, so I did have that link on the screen in the presentation. And Mark, maybe we could have somebody go to that slide and copy that link into the chat. That would be great.
Will do.
Great, thank you. Let me identify the slide for you. It's slide 52, where that link is. Okay, let's see what some other questions here. Will you be presenting during the basically CDBG training later this week? Yeah, so the last slide, the question slide here, it did note that we are also going to be in Friday's session this week. During the basically CDBG course, we'll be talking about monitoring, and we'll dive deeper into subrecipient monitoring. That presentation will get a little bit more hands-on with some of the questions that you may have about monitoring your CDBG-CV subrecipients. Okay. Oh yes, we will definitely get into that. One of the questions asked here was, will any of the sessions cover how to pivot if a subrecipient is not utilizing the funds in a timely manner? Oh yes. Yeah, we will get into that. Pivot is great. I love the use of that term because yeah, you do have to think fast and you do have to act quickly. Whenever you see an instance of noncompliance or a deficiency in a program, nip it in the bud as quickly as possible. Don't let it fester. Don't let it become prolonged. All right, and just some more things about our session later this week. Okay. I think that pretty much covers it. I'm going to leave a couple more minutes here. If anyone has any other questions about CDBG-CV monitoring that they want to raise right now, we do have some time available to us. We finished up well in advance of our 2-hour window that we had for this session. So again, for those of you who wanted a break during the session, maybe you'll have it here at the end to add to your lunch period. So that would be good. So not seeing any more questions that haven't been addressed. I will make one last call, and we will close it out at 1 o'clock if we don't hear anything from anybody, or if not sooner. Any other questions? No? Okay. So Mark, if you want to close out the webinar at 1 o'clock, that would be good. We can do that, and perhaps at least for those participating in this session. Oh, here's a question. Okay, wait a minute. Must rents be documented as reasonable for emergency grant payments? Well, that's a good question. Wow. Okay, yeah, thank you. I think you would want to know that. Yeah. You're making payments to a landlord. Every payment that you make must be allowable, allocable, and it must be reasonable. So if a landlord is excessively charging or even applying a surcharge for the privilege of participating in this program for some absurd reason, then yeah, you need to you need to be wary of that. I think one of the ways in which you can document reasonable rents is to use your HUD fair market rents that you have available. Those are available on the HUD exchange, on HUDuser.org. Our policy development and research division has its own website, HUDuser.org, and you can find fair market rents there. Those would be a good barometer, if you will, for documenting the reasonableness of the rents that are for emergency grant payments. I think HUD would be concerned about anything that would be, out of the ordinary. Can you repeat your response to the question regarding remote monitoring? So I'm not sure what the exact question was regarding remote monitoring, but remote monitoring, I will say this, that remote monitoring and on-site monitoring are, from HUD's perspective, are indistinguishable. Obviously, remote monitoring, there's not going to be any client visits, visits to public facilities or housing units. But they are, from HUD's perspective, it's the same process that we follow. Whether HUD will engage in on-site monitoring, that is still a question, and that is something that you'll become aware of once HUD develops, once each field office develops its monitoring strategy for this year. Is it okay to pay a year's worth of rent and utilities? Again, it depends on the circumstances in that case. We did talk, I think, in the previous session about the case of arrearages was addressed in terms of how that may work in terms of paying for a rent and utilities. I'll leave it to going to information about that particular question in that session to address that. And we'll be addressing it later this week in all likelihood in the basically CDBG course. When spending CDBG-CV money as case management for kids that have aged out of foster care, an allowable expense. Again, this is a CDBG allowable expense within the right context, within the appropriate eligible activity. But what you need to establish is PPR tieback. That's the key thing. So if you can document that, you'll be good. Again, the reconvene time is going to be at 1:45. So without any, if there's no other questions at this time, I think we'll end the session. I want to thank you all for your attention today. And I look forward to seeing you all in the basically CDBG course. That's going to be valuable to you in terms of understanding not only the basics of of eligible activities and national objectives, but also of monitoring on day 3 in that Friday afternoon session. So look forward to seeing you again then, and have a good afternoon and a good lunch break. Thank you. Bye-bye.